Well, let's get started. And let me just say that we are so thrilled to be hosting Cherryl Smith, Professor Emerita of English at Cal State Sacramento, for a talk on her new book, Framing Israel. This is the book. It's not, difficult to read, and you won't be able to put it down. And ever since I read this book, I knew I'd want to have Cherryl present it at an AEN webinar. And I'm just so happy we could make it happen. And thanks to Cherryl and to Amy Elman, who I'll introduce in a minute, for working out all the details and for making the time. So this book is, one of those rare books that brings an enormous amount of research and analysis to bear, but in a way that's incredibly accessible and readable. And we learn about the way Israel is framed. We learn so much about Israeli history and about Middle East history. There's pages of footnotes, and it's well sourced. The perspective is rhetorical studies, and I think Cherryl will tell us more about that. And we learn a lot about how facts, information, seems to have so little impact on the discussion of Israel, whether it's in the media or in the academy or even in the street. But what's wonderful about this book is we also learn about Cheryl's personal journey. And so she recounts her sabbaticals in Israel and the Israelis that she meets in her journeys and in her trips, and the disjunct between what she finds in Israel and in those personal experiences, and then what she finds back home in Berkeley. So this is not a boring book. I think there are a lot of great books in the field of Israel studies and Middle East studies that are important to read, that are seminal, and they're very, very boring. But we all have to slog through them. This is not a book like that. It's really an important read, and I'll tell you a lot. But it is a great. It's not boring. It's not dull, and you'll really enjoy it. So it's not a novel. It is definitely scholarship. So powerful and engaging. And of course, it's really central to our issues and to our mission at AEN. The host for this event is AEN Section for Women, which is chaired by Amy Elman. Amy Elman, we share a last name, but we are actually not related. We did try to investigate that. There are Elmans in the US and in Europe who are not related. It's not a common spelling of the last name. But I feel like Amy and I are sisters, even though we're not related, because we've been in this business for a long time and interacted at conferences and for many years. So it's wonderful to have Amy chairing the women's section. It's among 8 new sections and interest groups that we have at AEN. And the goal of the section for women is really to address the issues and concerns of women faculty in AEN, which, Amy and I and others in the leadership team at AEN, we really see in some respects those are unique and may require a unique set of strategies and approaches to address them. So we're really delighted that the Section for Women is sponsoring its first webinar is this one with Cherryl Smith, and we wish it much success. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Amy, who will introduce Cherryl, but I first want to say a few words about the remarkable Amy Elman. So our Amy Elman is Professor of Political Science and the William Weber Chair of Social Science at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. She graduated from Brandeis University with a BA, and then she went on to receive her MA and PhD at New York University. And during her tenure at Kalamazoo College, she's also been a visiting scholar at Middlebury College, at Harvard, at Uppsala University, at Haifa University. She has lots of awards, and her bio is very, it's filled with them. So I'll only say a few in the interest of time, but she is a Fulbright a scholar. She's won 2 Fulbrights. She's had fellowship from the National Endowment for Humanities, a number of other grants from Hebrew University as well. Her work focuses on women's rights and against anti-Semitism domestically, as well as within Europe. And she's been doing that work for over 3 decades. She has 4 published books, 3 with a focus on European integration. And last year, Amy wrote for us this terrific pamphlet. If you haven't yet seen it, this is the 6th in our pamphlet series on BDS and the pinkwashing phenomena, and it's available on our website. So just a few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. A number of people wanted to come today and had a conflict and couldn't make it, but want to be able to hear it later. So we'll be recording it. We do have the chat as functional, and you know, feel free to include comments or remarks as we go. We'll save the chat at the end and share it with Cherryl and with Amy. So we should have plenty of time for questions and comments. You can send direct messages to Spencer Kent, our Senior Associate for Membership, and he'll make sure they get asked. We'll see how we go. We could be a small enough group that we're just able to kind of make ourselves known and raise our hand in order to ask a question. So we'll see how that works. But let me now turn it over to Amy to introduce Cherryl and get us rolling.
Thanks so much, Miriam. And also thank you, Spencer, for helping us organize this. One of the things that the women's section really wants to do this year is to really highlight very innovative, recently released books, and this is our first. So those of you who are members of the section, one of the benefits of today is being able to get a free copy of this wonderful book. So we're delighted to make that work available to you. Let me begin by noting that Professor Smith is the Professor Emerita of English at Cal State Sacramento and recently retired and comes to us by way of Tel Aviv and has lived in Tel Aviv since 2016. Her academic field is rhetoric and composition. It might help to explain the reasons why it's so beautifully written. After completing her doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara, her first teaching position was at Harvard University, and her publications include many books and articles on writing and rhetoric. I would say that this is one of the best books that I've read on Israel. And that what makes it so is that the case studies that she presents are refreshing. There is an admirable absence of jargon. And for those who I would say may not even be terribly interested in Israel, anyone who's interested in politics and how political issues are framed would also find this book incredibly useful. I think it's going to be not just a fantastic read for members, but it is a very useful book to teach with, even if one's not focused specifically on Israel, particularly in very partisan times. It opens with the book Framing Israel, actually opens with how framing works. And Cherryl, you note that frames make information coherent, and you in turn help to tear apart different primary frames that help us to understand oftentimes the things that we need to understand have to do with why it is that facts don't seem to matter so much. And I thought that we'd open with, what was your motivation for writing such a book?
My turn, apparently. Thank you so much. I mean, I can't tell you how gratifying and exciting it is for me to have my book read by such scholarly and brilliant people as I'm getting to know you. And I worked on this book in quite an isolated way for many years. Your question was about the, anyway, I'm very honored to be here and also to be at the inaugural women's section, which is also an honor. I forgot your question. Motivation. Oh, my motivation to write the book or to write the, yes. I mean, I'm very, this is really something because it is for you that I wanted to write such a book. That is, I want to get to the students who have no way of addressing what's going on campus, but first I have to get to their teachers. and you completely understand exactly what I was trying to do. My motivation to write the book came from actually a kind of life-changing experience really that I had. And I recount a bit of it at the beginning of the book. I have a chapter that's called Berkeley to Jerusalem and Back. And it's the and back part that was the life-changing part. Going to Israel was amazing. It was my first trip there in 2000. Took my 9-year-old son with me. He was 9 then. And we lived in a neighborhood in Jerusalem and traveled all over the country on city buses, regular buses. We made friends, lifelong friends, actually. And I tell a little bit about that and what it was like to be there at a particular time that it happened to be. I had a sabbatical coming up in the fall semester. So we went in the summer. I'd never been there. I was shocked that I was so, felt at home there. And it was 2000, as you remember, was the summer of the Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat peace talks. And it looked like it was going to happen, that there was going to be peace. And people I met were very excited about this, worried about how it was all going to work out, but peaceful. They thought, finally, we're going to have peace with the Palestinians and we can go on just living our lives in a normal way as a normal country. So we came back in September that year. And just a week or two later, a couple of weeks later, the Intifada broke out, the second Intifada, and there was no peace happening. And I was living in Berkeley. It's where I went. I was an undergraduate there, and I always loved Berkeley and came back to it. It's not so far from Sacramento. And I was surprised. I was basically shocked. This was the life-changing thing. I couldn't understand why no one seemed to notice that the buses that we'd ridden on, by the way, were getting blown up. And the pizza, we had actually been at that pizza, Sabaro Pizza, right downtown Jerusalem. It was blown up. And somehow there wasn't much interest in the people who were getting blown up. There was a lot of interest in figuring out what forced people into wanting to blow up buses. And for a long time, several years, it was 5 years before we went back to Israel because of the Intifada. I kept trying to talk about it. When I got back to campus, I tried to talk about it. I talked to my neighbors and my friends, and somehow I kept thinking, well, they just don't know anything about this. I was there, maybe you want to hear about it, but no one really did want to hear about it. So it felt like there was no room really for a dialogue. And for a long time, this was very disturbing to me. And at some point after these trips that I recount in the book, it occurred to me that what's really bothering me is the language. My field is rhetoric. Maybe I can figure this out, sort of unpack how we got to this position where you can't really give any information because it's already been, as I discovered later, framed. It's already been classified in such a way that there's really nothing you can do to disrupt a particular view of Israel that seems to dominate now.
Right. Your point was that facts don't seem to matter. And the refreshing thing about your book is you don't begin by telling us about facts. You begin to tell us about the frames such that those facts don't matter or are interpreted in wildly different kinds of ways. I was wondering if you could share with the audience the different frames that you reveal to your readers.
Sure. What happened was I when I decided I wanted to write about this, I didn't really have the tools inside of composition studies. I didn't think, maybe it's there now, but what I found was the language that was going on in the media, and my usual trusted media, New York Times or CNN or just mainstream media, not something way out. And you know, what was being said on campus, you know, just didn't fit. And I started looking into, I felt at one time, a point that the whole framework was messed up. And I started looking into the terms frame and framework, and I remembered about cognitive framing. I knew about that. And then I moved over to media studies, where they use rhetorical framing analysis to analyze the perspectives that media emphasize on any topic. Usually they look at maybe a specific event or a specific text. And I took on what turned out to be this enormous project of wanting to explain all of the ways that Israel is framed. So it took a long time. I started just gathering newspaper reports and news accounts. And what you do is you start looking at the patterns of language, the way that a reader is pushed to have a particular interpretation over other interpretations, repeated topics, the emphasis of stories, and metaphors that are used. So over quite a long period of time, I started gathering this and sorting them out into categories, which is how rhetorical framing analysis works. You're trying to figure out what is the perspective, the dominant perspectives that any text shows. And I had ability to do that out of English. So instead of looking at just a particular event, I decided to try to look at the frames overall, because that was my problem. It really wasn't one event that happened that I felt misinterpreted. It was sort of a whole way of approaching Israel. So if you want, you know, I sorted this out eventually. It takes the whole book to explain each frame, but I can give you an overview.
Just a few, whether or not you want to talk about spotlights, bandwagons, fault analogies, the world of the worst, any one of those. You have several for us, but I was wondering if we could get a taste of what some
Well, a taste of, I guess I'll start with the first one. The first one I called the spotlight fallacy, which is each one of these frames, by the way, when you use them in argument, are fallacies, or rhetorical or logical fallacies. They look real until you start drilling down and paying attention to what's missing. And that's, by the way, the most important thing, what's left out of the frame. So the sort of overarching frame is the frame of only conflict. That is, when you're going to hear about Israel, and I'm living here now, so I know that Israel is not just about the conflict, and I keep waving my hands around it, but so here's a frame. Like if you think of a literal, you know, picture frame, and you don't get to see what's outside of it, you just see what's inside of it, right? And so what's inside of the discussion about Israel is only conflict. Even if you're talking about the Batsheva dance company is coming to New York to perform, somehow you're going to hear about the conflict. And it creates not only a misunderstanding, but also distortion, right? Because you're looking through a very narrow lens, you know, like you're looking through a microscope where things look distorted, right? You're not looking at the broader picture, right? So actually in that first frame, I talk a lot about sort of pop cultural things, how you know, so some old rock star, Israel gets a lot of the old rockers come here, and what you hear about that is they might boycott. Someone might, you know, they may, even though they decide to come here and all their fans are waiting for them, they might suddenly become so anti-Israel that they'll just cancel their concert. I always wondered about that. It doesn't really make sense, but Israel is unlike any other country in the sense that it's singled out, as we know. And so anything they do narrows down in that frame. And that was the first one. All the other frames actually sort of misinterpret the conflict. And so let's say I have a frame about the second one is the false, you can say it's a false premise the first premise about understanding the conflict is that it's a struggle over land, simply that. If we would just divide it up differently or not divide it or do something else, everything would be fine. And that's where the history had to come in. I had to, you know, explain that. But once you start from that, from a false premise, then what follows it is not going to be true, right? I mean, if your starting point is limited and actually wrong, from my perspective, wrong, and historically wrong. I mean, so then you have a whole series of problems in trying to talk about Israel because it's already been framed. You see what, yeah. So, and then there's 6 of these, which you can, you know, flip up in the book. And you can, and I had these kind of, it took a long time actually to be able to label them. That was a lot of the work of my, because I wanted it to be accurate and I wanted it to be focused so that we could then say, oh, they're boycotting Israel again. They're having apartheid week. And you can say, well, how am I going to address that if I'm a student on campus? And they've said right out, it's an apartheid state and it should be boycotted. And you can step back from it and say, well, that's pretty much the framing Israel as the worst place in the world, isn't it? You don't have to know. One of the problems I think students have, and I certainly had as a faculty member even, I don't know a lot. I mean, I do now, I've read a lot, but I didn't know a huge amount about, you know, Israeli history and Jewish history and all the things that you think you have to say, you have to be able to respond to, but you could say, I don't think it's the worst place in the world, you know. And as far as what you mentioned about, I think Miriam mentioned about the personal aspects in the book, I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that that if you've been to Israel at all, you probably have a pretty different perspective on it than someone who says, you know, it's an apartheid country where people don't get along. That's not the case. And if you come here, it's a real country like other countries, right? And so if you get sucked, well, one thing I would hope would happen after reading the book is that you would be less sucked into the anti-Israel discourse that controls the argument. So if you can step back and say, well, this is just a framing, it was a narrow framing, and there's a lot more to it. And you don't even have to argue their points to say, have you ever actually been there? Do you know anything about this country that, you know, before you decide it's the only country in the world that deserves to be boycotted?
Well, one of the things that you do that's kind of lovely is that you make transparent, make very, very clear the ways in which there's such peer pressure to conform, and that peer pressure to conform to a particular ideological stance ends up replacing logic. And I think that that's a useful lesson, not only in the discussion of Israel, but in the discussion of lots of things right now. This pressure to conform actually gets in the way of being able to have logical discussions, whatever they are, right? And I thought that was a particularly useful insight and one that would help students. I was wondering if you could share with us some of your observations as well about postmodernism, because that's where you locate a lot of the development of faulty framing.
Yeah, I have the 3rd chapter actually is titled Why Citing Facts Have So Little Impact. And I don't want to blame it entirely just on postmodernism, but there is a, and I tried to, because it's a general audience book, right? And I appreciate that you noticed that and enjoyed it in that way. But I wanted to get to students, and I want them for faculty to read it as well. But in trying to explain a theoretical kind of framework for thinking about how Israel is framed, I devoted a chapter to kind of theorizing about how the frames work and limit our ability to communicate, to have different points of view. So postmodernist perspective, in which our lived experience or our position influences or changes what we see as reality, right? That is, we we can't, we've, postmodernism, and by the way, I was running a postmodernist writing center while I was having this, these insights being developed. So it's not as if I didn't sort of, buy the theories or participate in them. I do, but in real life, there are some things that are factual. Like there are real historical moments, and we have archaeology, for instance, in Israel that sort of disrupts the storyline that there were no Jews here. It makes it impossible to have, but that doesn't matter if you take a more broad view of the postmodernist perspective. And I think what's happened is that although postmodernist theory would say that there aren't any particular theoretical positions that are any better than any others, they sort of, that's not true in real life. That is, you have a spin on it that is a Marxist spin, and that means that your ideology influences what counts as facts. That is, if my ideology is dismissed as a Zionist, and I didn't even know that, I was so naive, I didn't know that being a Zionist was a bad thing. But when I discovered that, it's because and then your point of view is gone because you're ideologically wrong, right? And I think that's a problem we're having. And you're right, not just about Israel, but on about many things, where there's only a sort of party line of what you can say or think.
In fact, you said there's no expectation of political diversity or of even offering multiple political perspectives. And that as you're doing your work, you've got plenty of colleagues coming up to you, kind of almost like closet cases saying, I'm a Zionist, but, right? I would never say this publicly. And, as someone who's retired, speaking to so many folks who are still, on campuses and engaged, do you have any advice for other academics fighting anti-Israeli bias, aside from reading your book, which I think would give everybody a leg up? But if you had to just give us some bits of advice here?
I want to, and first of all, I will also admit that I don't think I would have written this book if an early retirement hadn't been, in my future, not too far down the line. I mean, I was very aware of that. As a full professor, I still was aware that I'm taking on a lot of other disciplines in a way to challenge them. I guess advice-wise, first of all, be strong and know that you're actually not crazy. That is, you were in Israel or you've read a lot, and you know that it isn't a black and white situation, that usually things aren't, and that it would help to look at it from multiple perspectives. And if you're shut down, first of all, you have to take care of yourself. You have to go through your classes. You have to get your tenure. You have to do all those things, and that takes a lot. It takes courage, really. Now, it shouldn't really have to, but it does. And I think, and also you have this network. You have people. I really was quite lonely about it at the very beginning because we didn't have any organizations. There are now some. There are quite a few now. And that helps, and you need to network and to remind yourself that you're not making this up. That it really is a distorted perspective. And I would say one other thing about the frames. That is, I'm not promoting piling up a whole different new set of frames and say, you ought to look at it this way only. I'm saying you're looking at a very narrow part of what Israel is. And when you do that, you distort everything. And so let's back away and really talk about the whole picture. What's going on in the whole Middle East and what's happened to the Jews over centuries. I mean, it's a lot that is just tossed out when you get so narrowed down.
So a more expansive, holistic view of Israel, culture. There's so many other things going on with Israel besides the conflict, and also taking part in organizations so that you can kind of mitigate the isolation that attends so many folks right now.
Yes, that's very important. Very important.
I can see people eager to enter into the conversation. Is there anything else that you want to say before we start opening up and letting
That's fine,
other
we can
people
open up,
engage
that's-
with them? I don't mean to be so selfish here.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Whoops, what happened? I'm
Nothing,
done.
we're still all here waiting. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with
Oh.
us, Cheryl, before we open up?
No, I'm trying to open it up now. I mean, I think we're in the midst of a really wonderful conversation about this. So, yeah, that's fine. Who wants to start?
We're a small enough group. I just suggest that when you're not speaking, so that we don't have the echo, that we close our mics, but who would like to go first?
I guess I would like to say something. And as a scientist, this whole POMO, lit, crit, there is no objective reality, has always perplexed me. And so it's interesting to hear you link, and it makes perfect sense, Cheryl, to hear, this link to not just how Israel is framed, but how life in general. And I used to have these arguments with my colleagues on the social science humanities part of campus that had drunk the Kool-Aid about reality, in which they would insist that there absolutely was no reality. And I would say, well, please don't get on a plane, because gravity in the United States actually is exactly the same as gravity in France. And that never elicited any kind of response. And Amy, you alluded to it in your introduction, or maybe Cheryl, that there is reality, that there are some things, of course it's a gradient. I'm not arguing that culture and things like that don't affect things, but to argue, as seems to have been, the pattern in the 90s and up until today, that not only is there no objective reality, but for example, if you haven't lived a reality, then you cannot comment on it and judge it, which of course, as scholars, we're all eventually asked to do. Anyway, I'll stop my discourse here, but thank you. I will read your book with fascination and probably give it to some friends who need a good lesson in framing.
Good. I do think there's a reason why the Amcha initiative, I don't remember the statistics exactly, came out with you were a certain percentage, a pretty high percentage more likely to sign a boycott petition if you were in the English department, as opposed to anyone in the sciences. There's much fewer people, many fewer people who want to take that kind of a step are in fact in the humanities and social sciences. I mean, I think there's a reason for that, because we do have, we can theorize, and I love theorizing. I mean, graduate seminars is the most fun, but there are real life things, and you're right, exactly. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, in the sciences, I think that also has led to a kind of mindset where, in general, scientists oppose boycotts, and we oppose boycotts because we learned a lesson from Lysenko and science in other totalitarian regimes, which had horrible effects on people.
I see that there's a question from Donna Divine.
Yeah, can you hear? Yeah. One of the things that has bothered me about the kind of uniformity of the campuses towards Israel, there are two components, or there are many components, but two that I find very troubling. One is, if you use the language of social justice, students seem to think that if you use the word justice, you automatically will come out with the morally pure answer. And as someone, I assume like Amy, who has taught political theory for many years, you know that using the term justice produces as much controversy and discussion, and it's very difficult to have a kind of all right or all wrong, which leads to one of the things that is also disturbing. I think, and we're very unable to take care of it in COVID-19 by the kind of flattening of our experiences through Zoom. But people don't understand that in politics, there are rarely win-win solutions. That when you look at it, and what I tried to do in my courses on the conflict, on the history of the Palestinian-Israeli Arab conflict, is to get students focused on certain periods in history and look at the choices available to people. The choices available to people in the 19th century were far different from the choices available to people on the eve of World War I, post World War I, 1930s, that, you know, I could go on and on. And those choices are usually most people will try to maximize their own benefits or the benefits for their family, or do the safest thing possible if they're dangerous. I mean, you know, a whole host of reasonable criteria. So the study of politics along with the ideas of social justice have been almost totally flattened in the discourse on the Middle East and in the discourse on other areas as well. And that does bother me. I thought I'd throw that out.
Could I say
Well,
something?
Can we just hear from Cheryl, and then Gerald? I see that you're next.
No, go ahead. That's fine. I wasn't.
Okay. I just want to say before we go to Gerald that one of the things that you do in the book, Cheryl, is that you make it really clear why those with so-called progressive sympathies are expected to lie only with the side of conflict against Israel. So I think you do a nice job in your book on that.
Yeah, Cheryl, a practical question. What has happened to you since this book has come out?
Well, I'm safely in Tel Aviv, so and I've retired.
Oh, okay.
So I just left the. No, I mean I had already made Aliyah when I wrote this book. Or not when I wrote it, but those things aren't actually connected. But well, it's just come out, and it came out practically exactly when the COVID virus came out. So
If we want to
I'm
get,
getting good feedback. Certainly, I'm getting some feedback from academics, and also from people who've said, I haven't been able to talk to my close friend or my cousin for a long time, and now maybe I can figure out how to even approach talking with them about it, because I realize that I'm never going to be able to answer the bigger claim that they're making. I can start slow and say, wait a minute, there's more to this story, and we could step back from this narrow view of Israel that are the frames that I identify in the book. But yeah, it's a brand new book. So
is there?
One of the questions that just came up has to do with, could you use one of your frames to explain this lack of diversity in terms of what gets presented on campus? Cheryl, could you do that for
okay,
us?
so let's see. I have a frame that I call the neighborhood bully frame. Well, let me not just jump in before I decide what I'm going to talk about. You want the question is,
could you
the
use
diversity
one
of
of your
thought
frames
that's
to
missing.
talk about the relative absence of diversity in terms of the discussions that we have on campus? That was one of the questions.
Okay. I think actually the frame shut down discussion. It's a given that Israel is, that the conflict is a struggle over land. That's a given. It's a starting point. It's a given that Israel is always at fault, the neighborhood bully. I use that expression. These frames are actually the encompass the whole conversation that you can have. So it's not as if there's, you know, there's an argument going on. It's where many disciplines start. If they say the word Israel, they're talking about the worst place in the world, or they're talking about the they've changed the language so that it's a colonizing country. Our problem is that they've got the discourse, and we have to open up that discourse again, right? So go ahead.
So here's somebody who's eager to jump in. Nathan Kuppermann.
Hi. I'm a professor at UC Davis, and Joel Haas is on the line as well. I have a comment. I don't know who it was who made the previous comment about how can we, best get the message to the non-converted, that is, the outside groups. And so, I serve as the chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine at UC Davis. And, we started well over a year ago, a big diversity and inclusion committee really focused on anti-Black racism, anti-brown racism, et cetera. But when I saw, I've been aware of what's going on the UC Davis campus with Jewish students for a while, but obviously the heat has been raised. And when I saw that, I think we need to just adopt the language of diversity and inclusion that's used for other races and ethnicities. And we're looking for allies in this. And so I took this information that I had accumulated, actually Joel Haas, who's on the call, had shared with me, and I went right to the president of the university, who's a friendly acquaintance of mine, and he knows that I do a lot of diversity and inclusion work around, other minorities. And I said, dear Chancellor, look at these data. 75% of UC Davis students are feeling threatened or scared about anti-Semitism. How can we turn a blind eye to that while we're in the middle of all this anti-racism work? And my only ask of him was, why can't we throw anti-Semitism into the umbrella of racism? And he was very responsive to that. And he says, he said, Nate, I'm very aware of what's going on. I'm meeting with student leaders. I don't know exactly what will come with it, but what my approach has been is that I want to use the same language around anti-Semitism that we're all using in the language of anti-racism in general in this country, and put it under the same umbrella.
Cheryl,
that would,
thoughts on that?
go ahead. Yeah, that would be great. That's obvious. We've been sort of kicked out of that conversation, it seems to me, across the way at Sac State, where I was. I think administrators are pretty open to this. I think the bigger problem seems to be inside of the scholarship that has labeled Israel as the worst place in the world and labeled it as an apartheid country and so on. And that scholarship is the basis for pedagogy. So I would be thrilled to see something like that happen, where we could say, look, this is just another ethnicity, or this is the state of that ethnic group. It's no different from any other national country. If we can do that, then, and I think what's blocking it is the way Israel is maligned in these sort of defeatist and limited views. But yeah, that's fine. That's exactly what should happen. If you can make that happen, that would be great. I was for a while the Hillel advisor for the Sac State and Davis Hillel when I was at Sac State. So.
And I think we have time for one more question or comment. It would be great if we could hear from someone who's not already asked Cheryl a question.
In terms of diversity, I am now doing research on the Holocaust in Hungary. I'm researching, I have a lot of connections to that, which I kind of avoided, and now I'm sort of dealing with and writing perhaps a book about it. And I've tried to bring that up in discussions about diversity. You know, why don't we have some Holocaust related content or curriculum in the College of Education? And I was told, well, that's in Germany. We have, you know, we have ethnic cleansing and genocide in our inner cities. Like, who would want to hear about what happened in Germany or Hungary? In a more refined manner, let's say. It wasn't so blunt, but that was the basic gist of it. So there are my comments.
Wow. It's amazing.
Yeah.
No, it really is. I mean, you know, I think, I mean, I haven't been on campus for, 5 years ago. So, and even then I was teaching half-time toward my retirement. So my feelings, things are much, much worse than they were when I was having a problem with the way Israel was presented, because I think it has spread out to other disciplines where diversity of thought is more, it seems to be limited on all kinds of topics, but particularly those related to the Jews. There's no way of sugarcoating that. It just seems that we're being left out of the discussion of racism, anti-Semitism, as people have been discussing. So, yeah, I mean, again, I admire everyone working hard to make changes on campus and telling your own story and teaching what you know, within the confines of your need to maintain your own sanity and to get your tenure. And so, yeah, thank you all for sharing those things with me anyway, with all of us.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, because one of the things that your book does is it helps folks to feel same. It exposes, it makes real clear what the framing's been. And as you know, not just with regard to Israel, although Israel prominently in your book, but what's happened on college campuses, such that we are bereft of the kind of intellectual engagement and intellectual pluralism that marks any institution of higher learning. So we're grateful to you for your work and for your time, and to the Academic Engagement Network for its work. These are, as you know, hard times. I wouldn't want any of us to think that it's all lost. One of the things that I see happening is an increased consciousness about how bad things have become. And so I think that there's an opportunity to address our concerns within that larger context as the tide seems to be turning to, one would hope, a more engaged political series of conversations. So I thank everyone. And again, for those of you who are in the women's section, one of the treats that you'll have is the ability to get a copy of this book, because one of you wrote in the chat that you had already bought so many of the copies. I'm not going to say who it was. So many of the copies already available through things like eBay. So we're on to you big time. Thanks so much again. And with that, Miriam, is there any way that you'd like to add on and close?
Well, I want to thank you, Amy and Cheryl. You know, we try to keep these to an hour over the lunchtime period so people can get back to their teaching and their committee work. And I thank God every day that I'm on leave and don't have to do that and can just enjoy. I spent the morning rereading the book. And it really is, it's really a powerful read. And I think it's an optimistic read. I mean, although it cites the problems, you know, as you noted, Amy, I mean, it does take you through the shoddy research, the crappy arguments, the one-sided framing, that we know is the way this field is being taught and what our students are being exposed to. But it also ends on a very optimistic note about being able to actually reach people through dialogue and through sharing information. And I think there's different ways to do that, different ways to reach students, different ways to reach faculty, different ways to reach administrators. I don't think anybody's beyond the pale. I think we can even talk to, ardent BDS scholars we have to live with them for 40 years on a campus, right? Sometimes they're not going anywhere. We have to figure out how to deal with them too. And that's what AEN is all about. It's really about trying to give our faculty members, many of whom don't have not work or research or teaching in the area of Israel or Middle East or political science or social science, and give them the tools to understand the topics of anti-Semitism today and anti-Israel delegitimization today and what BDS is all about, but then let faculty figure out what strategies work best for their campuses and for their region and for their state, and to network with others to get those best practices. So that's really what AEN is all about. And we're grateful, Cherryl and Amy, that you took the time to set this up and, to really give us an hour where we can drill down into what our mission and what our activism on campus is all about. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who joined today.